From Dead Man Walking to The End of the Affair, many consider our guest to be the next great American composer. Hi, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with Jake Heggie. Can all emotion be represented musically?
As far as I can tell, I think so. That's why I'm in the business. I guess I'm exploring that.
What brought you into this in the first place? Why do you care to write classical music? If you even categorize it
and
as
opera
classical.
in particular. Well, actually, I think of it more as music theater. Not musical theater per se, but music theater, because in a very American way, it combines a lot of different elements, all the elements that I grew up with. I started out as a teenager. I grew up watching great shows like The Carol Burnett Show, Sonny and Cher, the very end of the Ed Sullivan years, and great variety where there was every kind of music going on all the time. They would have Ella Fitzgerald, and then they would have Marilyn Horne on, and then Beverly Sills, and then, Joni Mitchell. And my father was a saxophonist, and we had all kinds of music going on in the house. But I was always drawn to what you would call classical music. I don't know why. I just was. And to this day, I believe it is a very valid and important and extraordinary way to tell stories. And I think that's why I like it so much, is that it's this heightened world of emotion and feeling where you can go further with absolutely everything and take human beings, actually they're very extraordinary human beings who do the performing, right to the edge of what seems humanly possible, emotionally, vocally, physically, and tell a story with that. And I think it's a riveting way and a very compelling way for an audience to experience a story and a musical journey.
What makes opera, though, different from musical theater? Why isn't it? Is it the way it's performed, presented? Where is the differentiation?
There is a very fine line there, but in general, opera singers have a different kind of trained voice. They have to have discipline for years and years and years of purely vocal training so that they can do these extraordinary things that composers like me demand, and composers through history have demanded that they do. And it's a very rigorous and difficult history of training that they need to go through to get to a certain point. They have to have the talent first, and then they have to have the discipline and the sense of competition to want to actually do this. Mm-hmm. I've said many times, I don't think there's anything harder than being an opera singer. To go through all that training and all that work, be guaranteed nothing, and to depend on these little pieces of flesh in your throat to do these superhuman things, as well as act, take an audience along, pay attention to a conductor, a director, the costume person who's telling you, put on a few pounds, huh? And, the makeup person's like, oh, how are we going to take care of that? All of these things going on. Plus you have to be able to sing, these traditional roles that lots of the people in the audience already know very well. And a lot of people are just coming to and do it convincingly. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I'm on the other side of the pen,
But take me back structurally.
Yeah.
How is it different to write opera than, say, musical theater?
It's interesting because I'm about to write a musical. I grew up loving Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim, which are very, even though they're musical theater writers, they're very operatic. I mean, the vocal range. Generally, in musical theater, it's a smaller vocal range. The people have to be great actors first. They don't have to be great singers first. In opera, it's always first about the singing, and then if there happen to be a good actor, you're very lucky. In a musical, generally speaking, you're looking for a great actor who can also sing very well, and that's a big difference. It's also in terms of the demands that you can place on those singers because of that. It's the size of the emotion and the music that you're going to write to support it. In musicals, generally you have a small pit band. I mean, it used to be much larger. But in opera, you generally have a full orchestra. Now, there are operas that exist with a small orchestra, anything from 2 to 25 instruments, and then up to 70, 100 instruments, And that's another difference in opera. People train their voices to be able to carry without amplification over an orchestra of that size, which is extraordinary too. So there's very different things that just in terms of the actual technical tools we have at our disposal in terms of the actual performers. But then there's also the way you're going to tell a story. In opera, it's generally wall-to-wall music. It never stops for dialogue. And in musicals, very often you have stops for dialogue. So that it becomes much more about the duet, the solo, this number, that number, the reprise of that number. And in opera, it's a continuous stream of music throughout the whole evening.
Right.
So there's a lot of differences.
But you make the reference then to writing a musical now for you. Is that more challenging, or is that kind of a vacation?
I have made it a policy only to take on projects that kind of terrify me. Because I think as an artist, the only way you grow is to constantly challenge yourself. Otherwise, you risk becoming stagnant and stationary, which I think would be any artist's greatest fear, that you're repeating yourself. So I just make it a point to look for projects that are challenging in different ways. Dead Man Walking, my first opera, was an enormous scale, and I had never done an opera. So that was absolutely terrifying on every level. This was, the new one that I've just written, The End of the Affair, is a very small scale, 6 singers, no chorus, and an orchestra of 24. And that's another kind of challenge, because everything is very, very exposed. When you have massive forces at work, there's plenty of room for things to get lost if there's any sort of, flaws or, pimples on the score. But in a very chamber size environment, there isn't as much room. Everything's very exposed. So then with a musical, I'm faced with this thing of needing to write very set numbers that are memorable through the evenings, so that you can have reprises. And I want to bring, like I said, I came from a world of more musical theater and into the opera world. And I've been floored by the possibilities and the expansion, the expansiveness of the opera world. But then to go back into musical theater and see what it is that I bring from the opera world into musical theater, that's the next challenge for me. And to do it with a combination of singers that are classically trained and are trained as Broadway singers.
Can I ask you what the topic is of the Broadway piece?
I can tell you that it's going to be another project with Terrence McNally, who I collaborated with on Dead Man Walking. But I don't want to give away the... I don't want to give it away, because we're just getting going on it. But it's a project I've wanted to do for a long time.
Okay, take me back. You started out in this business on the other side. You were a performer.
Yes, a pianist. I still do perform. But from the time I was 5 years old when I started taking piano lessons, I think I was very lucky. I always knew I wanted to be in music somehow. I didn't know how when I was that young, but I knew that it resonated with me very deeply. And then I started writing when I was around 11. My father died very suddenly when I was 10. And around 11, I started composing. And the idea of composing and performing took me back to the 19th century and the 17th century, 18th century, went with Bach and Mozart and Chopin and Schumann and all those great composers that sort of played and championed their own works as well as wrote for other people. And I had this dream of something like that. And but actually at the time when I started composing, I hadn't put the connection together with that it had to really mean something. Yeah. So I was just writing pieces that had bazillions of notes and looked really impressive, but meant nothing. They looked really great. But
why classical, though? At that point, why was that the direction you went, if in fact that was what you were writing?
At that point, it was what I was writing. I don't know. There was just a depth and a breadth to the music that I didn't find anywhere else. Now, my sisters were listening to, at that time, Godspell, Hair, and Jesus Christ Superstar were all big, I'm really dating myself here. And, there was a real interesting thing happening in the music theater world in that regard. I didn't know much about opera at all, so my exposure was limited to this, except with the piano that I was doing. And I spent all my extra money from my paper route and from my allowance either buying new scores of like Beethoven sonatas or Mozart sonatas, or manuscript paper, or I was also avid about collecting silent movies. about what was unspoken. So there was a lot about what was unspoken that was interesting me right then. But I have to say, when I did then get into writing for the voice in my teens, I was much more interested in writing for Carly Simon and Barbra Streisand and Bernadette Peters and Carol Burnett, and, because that's what I had been exposed to.
Right.
And it wasn't until later, when I went away to school, that I suddenly was exposed to a much broader range of singing and this extraordinary ability that these trained singers have to cover this amazing gamut of human emotions with their voice, without even moving a muscle of their body, just by singing. There's something that just penetrates right to the heart of it. That is really remarkable. And it's another great way of taking people on an emotional journey, which is, to me, what music is about.
One thing critics write over and over again about your work is that you write for the voice. And that's the strong thing about you. You write for the voice, and not many people are doing that. Why is that? What does that mean to you? And is that a conscious thing you're doing at the time you write, or is it just turning out that way?
Well, I write for the voice because it's always what I've been drawn to. Once I found the human voice that I could actually write for it, it became my passion, and matching words with music and then hearing that come alive. And I think I learned about the human, because I'm not a singer myself, I learned really about the human voice through writing and performing with singers. But there's something just... The human voice is the most magical and mysterious instrument there is, because it can't be created. It's not something you can build. It's something that's either there or it's not. And it's something that takes, first of all, a gift, a natural gift and a talent for it, but something that then, if you're going to work with it, that takes great training and love and nurturing and care and discipline. And I think I've always been sort of overwhelmed by the magic and the power of the human voice. I mean, it's one of the very first things that we hear when we're born, is the human voice, and our mother's voice, and those that we love, their voice is talking lovingly to us. So I think the human voice is sort of, we automatically respond to it certain ways, and all other instruments, as far as I know, aspire to be able to sing like the human voice. There are just so many reasons, I think, but I naturally just was drawn that way. And then I had this ability to write well for the voice, and singers seem to like the things that I do, and so I always wanted to do more, and it's just been a natural progression. And I guess there's different areas of expertise and specialty for different composers. Mine happens to be the voice, and I love it. I couldn't be happier writing for the voice. So
with all that appreciation and understanding of the human voice, yours is really that bad?
Mine is terrible. Yeah, I sing like a frog. I used to sing in choirs when I was a teenager, but from now on, it's like in the shower or when I'm working, and that's one of the reasons I have to be completely alone when I work, because I do sing out loud. I do try melodies and see how the word setting is going, but I couldn't do it in public. No, I wouldn't put anybody through that.
Now, you performed for a while, but then you had to stop performing.
Yeah,
what had happened there?
I was really a concert pianist and playing for a lot of singers, and I was part of a 2-piano team that traveled around. And I was playing so much, and there had been some flaws in my training when I was young. And what happened was I wound up playing with a lot of tension. I had been taught that you play with curved, rigid fingers, which ultimately starts you playing with tension. And what happened was, as I was getting older and playing more, these fingers started curling under when I would play, just from all the tension, the muscles just caving in like this. And so eventually what happened is, during a certain year, it got so bad that I would sit down to play and my entire hand would just curl into a ball, into a fist. And it was burning like crazy. And I had been playing so much that I couldn't take time, or I wouldn't take time to fix it, to fix it. And so what happened was my body forced me to stop. And when that happened, I also, I fell into a kind of depression, because I had been working for over 20 years on playing and making music my life.
Yeah.
And so I stopped writing as well.
At the time, did you know whether or not you'd be able to ever play again?
Oh, I was sure I wouldn't be able to play again, certainly not in public. But because I wanted to play for myself, I couldn't imagine not being able to play the piano after all those years. It had been such a part of my life. It's such a natural place for me to be, that to think of myself never being there again was again one of the things that I think put me further into a depression. And so I worked with a wonderful teacher in Southern California who started me back at C major scales as slow as possible, just one finger at a time, and teaching me to play with a very natural technique and without any tension. And so after several years of really giving myself the rest and the permission to sort of start over again, I moved up to San Francisco in 1993 and started working at the San Francisco Opera. By then I decided that if I couldn't be in music, I would be adjacent to it, in the creative process. So I found out I could write. I became a writer for the UCLA Center for the Arts, and then for Cal Performances at UC Berkeley, and then a job that hadn't been open in like 15, 16 years at the San Francisco Opera opened up, and I became the writer for that company. So I was in the PR and marketing office as a writer, and all of a sudden I was in an environment with the most incredible singers in the world walking through regularly. Frederica von Stade, Thomas Hampson, Bryn Terfel, Renee Fleming, Sylvia McNair, and one of the first people to come through the office when I started working was this great singer, Frederica von Stade, who her friends call her Flicka, so I'll probably refer to her as that. And she came through, and we had met very briefly a few years before. And she remembered me. She did not know I was a musician. And she was just so generous and kind. And I was sitting in a lot of the rehearsals, and just the sound and power of those voices got me really excited about writing music again for the first time in about 6 years. And so I went home and I wrote these 3 folk song arrangements for her and gave them to her as a gift for opening night of the opera that she was in. And she said, what are these? And I said, well, this is from another life, but you really inspired me, and I just want you to have them. So she said, well, I'm going to come in earlier the next performance, and we're going to read through them. And we sat down, and we were reading through them, and I thought, well, this is as good as it's going to get. One of my favorite opera singers of all time sitting reading through these things, and I'm actually playing. And she said, these are really good. Would you like to give a concert together sometime? After I picked my jaw up off the ground, I said, yeah, okay, that would be great. And true to her word, she asked me to play for her. She commissioned other things. And lucky for me, she also has, in the best way, a big mouth. She started telling other great singers, that I wrote these songs. And so the most unusual thing started happening. I was working in my office at the opera and writing songs in my spare time at home. But these great singers would come through, not for interviews, but to say, I hear you write songs. Do you have anything that might be right for me? And so then I started actually doing both. I was writing for the opera and doing these songs, and they were starting to be performed all over the world. And then one day the general director said to me, have you ever thought about writing an opera?
Now, see, that's what I think is the most amazing part of the story. Not that he came to you and said that, but I would think in that environment, a lot of times people would be like, wait a minute, you're the publicist, stop doing this on the side. Instead, they nurtured you more.
It was a very sort of Cinderella kind of thing. I was shocked by it too. Well, when he first mentioned it, it was, it wasn't interfering with my work in the first place. And it actually, I was able to be very close to the singers in a way that a lot of the other publicists weren't able to, because I knew what it was like being on the inside of the music. And I was an extremely well-trained musician myself. And so there, it never interfered with the work. In fact, really, it enhanced the work. Mm-hmm. I was exhausted all the time because a PR job will take as much time as you are able to give to it and more. And then music is the same way. They say music is a very jealous mistress, and it's very true. Demands a lot of time and focus and attention. So I was literally working all day, sometimes at nights when there were performances, and then whenever I had spare time, writing music. So when the general director called me into his office this one time and said, I'd like to talk to you about writing an opera, I was ready to write the next press release. And here he is asking me to write an opera. And that was Lotfi Mansouri, who really set the whole thing in motion that way. But he was serious, and he sent me to New York. I met with Terrence McNally. I couldn't believe any of this was happening, you know. And we got along very well. And it took about a year, and suddenly we were actually talking about ideas. And then, so I started working at the opera in 1994. And in 1998, January 1st, I became their first composer in residence, working on a major world premiere with Terrence McNally, based on Dead Man Walking.
And then if I've got it all correct, you get reviews that are saying a masterpiece, and I'm going to paraphrase this poorly, but the most important piece of American music since West Side Story, things like that. How does that affect you, though? How do you react to that?
Well, I felt very blessed, of course, to have... First of all, it was a charmed project. The whole creative team was amazing. You know, the director at that point was Joe Mantello, who's the Tony Award-winning director. Susan Graham and Frederica von Stade, two of the great voices in our world, singing two of my lead roles. Patrick Summers, the music director at Houston Grand Opera, who is one of the great opera conductors in the world, was my conductor. And the whole crew and team was just, you know, everybody was gung-ho to make this happen the right way, which says a lot about Lotfi Mansouri. Yeah. But, you know, you can think you have a good product, and then you put it on a stage in front of an audience, you never know. So I was very grateful at the response, you know. And that opened the door to lots of other things, because since then there's been many productions of Dead Man Walking around the country. And even before it opened, Patrick Summers, who was the conductor of that and his music director at Houston Grand Opera, got together with David Gockley, and before it opened, they had asked me to write my second opera.
End of the Affair.
End of the Affair. And, you know, it was a little bit scary transition, thinking about going from writing song cycles, you know, sets of songs, to writing a full-scale, you know, 3-hour opera. But it actually felt very natural for me. And that's when I think I realized for sure that I am a theater composer. My home is the theater. Because I just... developing character and psychology and motive and weaving that in through music and how these characters interact with their music and the drama, and serving that drama with all the things that I have from my history as a child and teenager growing up with the Carol Burnett Show, you know, right. etc. Putting all of that resource in there too, plus all the experience I had at the actual opera house working on productions. It all wove together so that it was something that made sense to me, and it felt very natural. And so I'm actually looking forward to continuing that way. I never, ever thought I would write an opera, because I hated opera when I was in my 20s.
Take me a little bit through what it feels like for you sitting through opening night. When you're seeing it, what goes through you?
It's nerve-wracking, because obviously I've lived with it longer than anyone else in that house, including the people on the stage. And I know the gesture and the intention of what I wrote, but it's very difficult. With opera, you don't get previews, like a Broadway show. Broadway show, you might get 2 or 3 weeks of actual previews. Performances in front of an audience where you can still tinker, and the performers can get used to being in front of an audience with it. In opera, it is shot right out of a cannon at the audience. And usually opening night, there's dozens, if not 100 critics from all over the world, not just locally. Pens poised, you know. And with opera now, you really are, right from the first performance, placed right up there. You have to compete with the greatest operas ever written in history, you know? That's the level that they're putting you against. So if you have the tools to start with in terms of the support, the great cast, the whole company being behind it and wanting to do it at the highest possible level, you've already got a good start. But sitting there opening night, I mean, you are relying on mere mortals to do these superhuman things and walk this tightrope for the audience and tell a story persuasively and express this music convincingly and naturally, and help them to embrace that and include them in that world, you know. And it's almost, well, it actually is the first time that they're doing it in front of a real audience. So yeah, it is nerve-wracking.
Can you take your hands off and let go and say, it's out there now, it's not mine?
Well, at some point you absolutely have to, because I'm not the one on the stage performing it, which is why we do rehearsals, rigorously. And
are you rewriting it, though, while they're going? Are you hearing things still on an opening night, or at that point, are you at peace?
No, I'm always looking at it, trying to look at it objectively, so that if there is something that's not working, maybe there'll be a chance in it for a future production I could change that or fix that or move that around. But so it's an ongoing process. Theater has to be alive, though, like language. It has to be alive and changeable, and otherwise it becomes, again, stagnant and predictable. And I think that's the death of art, when things become predictable. Art is about surprise, and certainly opera and music and is in general about surprise, doing the unexpected, and taking people on those life turns, that we all experience at some point.
Yeah.
But it has to be one of the most thrilling moments too. I think the opening night, when you feel that energy and that buzz in the audience, they're excited to be there. They wouldn't be there if they weren't. And so to feel that sort of energy, and the cast is excited. They've been working really hard, and they're ready to share it. So it's like something charging and pulling at the leash, ready to just break free, and then there's me just has to sit there and just let it happen.
Well,
it's stuff that's beyond your control.
Is thank you for taking the time and sitting down with us. And that piece you're working on with Terrence McNally is...
A musical.
A musical. Thank you. Jake Heggie.
It's great to talk to you. Thank you.